Hi, I thought I'd show you some examples of summarizing, paraphrasing, and quoting to help you kind of see the difference between those three different ways of incorporating text into your essays. I thought I'd use this example of the Declaration of Independence. 4th of July is coming up here, so it's probably a good time to be thinking about it. But I want to use it and think about how we might quote, paraphrase, and summarize different parts if we were writing an analysis of this particular document. So I don't know how familiar you are with the Declaration, but as important a document as it was, it's not very long. It's really only a couple pages. Like if I scroll down here, you'll see, and a lot of it's a list of all the things that King George had done to harm the American colonists and, reasons why the colonists wanted to declare their independence. But let's say we were writing a textual analysis about this document. I kind of created my own sheet here, so I'll be kind of going back and forth. But let's say I just want to give a very brief summary of this whole document in my introduction. Really, that's what you want to give in your intro. Maybe like a very brief overview. Later in the text, you can summarize particular sections of the text you're analyzing, but that summary is meant to be just maybe like a 1 or 2 sentence summary, enough so that the audience knows what the point of this text is. So, I created here just a sample summary that you might use in your intro. So I said, in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson makes the argument that people can and should eliminate a government that keeps them from their natural born rights, and that King George III has committed so many injustices against the colonists that it makes their separation from England necessary. So again, that I think summarizes everything important about this document. It has to do with these rights that people have, but a lot of it is about all the bad things that King George has done to the colonists, right? You have to keep in mind what a big deal this little document was. Essentially, Thomas Jefferson, who's credited as being the author of this text, but really it was written with the help of lots of the founding fathers. Essentially what they were doing was committing treason, right? They were saying, we're not going to adhere to the laws of England anymore. We're across the ocean, we're living in our own new place, and we're going to start our own government. So really this declaration is this see you later message from the American colonists, right? And a lot of it has to do with the fact that England was taxing the American colonists, but not providing them with any representation in British Parliament. So in other words, England was making all the rules, and they were expecting the colonists to give them money, but they weren't letting them have any rights as part of being English citizens, right? So what's the point of sticking around? So again, this is how you might give like a very brief overview, summary of the whole thing. If I wanted to, I could expand it a little, make it a couple sentences, but for our purposes, probably 1 sentence is good if I were going to include this in my introduction. So what I would say about citing summaries is that probably the longer the summary is and or the more detailed it is, probably it's more likely that you should cite that. Or for example, let's say, you're doing a research paper and you're using lots of different texts and you don't necessarily want to quote from a text so much or paraphrase it, but you just want to mention it briefly. Probably in a situation like that, if you're just kind of mentioning the text but not quoting from it, I would probably cite it just so that the audience knows where it's coming from. But what I would say is if you are, using one text like you guys are doing for your textual analysis, and you're going to be quoting from it and paraphrasing from it extensively, I'd say it's not as important to cite it here, right? So again, if I were doing a textual analysis just of the Declaration of Independence, if I were including this summary here, I probably would not need to cite this thing because I'm really talking about the whole document, right? Let's say you wanted to summarize a particular section of a text, and I think you'll be doing that, should be doing that in your textual analysis, right? So not only giving an overview of the whole thing, but maybe summarizing a particular section that you're going to quote from or paraphrase from in your body paragraphs, right? And you probably should be doing that because you don't want to assume that the audience knows what's going on in this text in these moments that you're quoting or paraphrasing from. So, and again, I should say here, those of you who are choosing to do commercials for your textual analysis, this is not going to be as relevant to you right now. You're probably talking more about images and these things that you see versus, verbal text, right? Whereas if you guys are doing a speech, this is going to be really relevant and important for you because you should be definitely citing lines from that speech. Either way, whichever one you're doing, this stuff is going to come up again in both of the last two essays they're going to do for this class. So that's why I'm going over it now. Even if you don't need it right now, eventually you will. Anyway, like I said, it's really common to want to summarize like a particular section of a text before you quote or paraphrase from it, right? So let's say, I'm going to flip back here. Let's say I wanted to summarize just this paragraph, right? Summarize it so that I can bring in a specific detail or quotation and then kind of analyze it, right? So let me flip back here. If I just wanted to summarize that one paragraph, I might say something like, Jefferson argues that King George is guilty of a series of harmful actions against the American colonists, and that it's the duty of people to take control of their government in order to restore the rights that have been taken from them in order to provide for future generations. So in that paragraph, he's really emphasizing, like, it's not that the government should rule us. We should be in control of our government. And when it's not meeting our needs, then we really need to take control and say, no, we're not doing this. We need to change things, right? Which is precisely what the American colonists wanted to do. But again, notice here, I probably would not cite this information because I'm going to specifically quote and paraphrase from it later in this paragraph, right? Like I mentioned before, if you were doing a research paper and if you just wanted to mention the Declaration of Independence briefly, you weren't going to quote or paraphrase from it later, and you're using a bunch of different texts, then yeah, maybe I would cite it here since it's the one instance where you're referring to this text in your paper. But, for our purposes, probably don't need to because it's not very detailed, right? So, let's say I want to then use a very specific part of this paragraph, right? I'm going to stick with the most famous line, the one that you've probably heard of from the Declaration, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You guys have heard that before, I'm sure. Again, this particular line is a little or a lot controversial in some ways because of this part here, right? All men are created equal. Jefferson and the founders are mentioning men here, so not women. And when they say all men, they mean all white men, right? That there are plenty of African men who are not part of this yet, right? So again, this line, there's a kind of a lot to say about it. But, if I wanted to use this in my paper, what I would want to decide is it better to quote this exact line or to paraphrase it and put it in my own words? And as I mentioned earlier, your kind of deciding factor is, can I say this thing better and in a simpler way than it is right now? And I think you would probably agree with me that no, probably not. Like, it's very well written, it's clear, and again, we know it's a very famous line, right? So this is something we would want to directly quote in our paper. Maybe there's stuff that comes later if we were going to, use it in our paper. We could kind of paraphrase it, put it in our own words, and it still get the same point across. But this line's too good and too famous to not give the actual quotation, right? So just to kind of remind you or show you, give you an example here. Here's how it might look if I directly quoted this line. I always want to give some sort of intro, specifically like a signal phrase, right? Where I either mention who's saying it or just something so that we're not starting a sentence with the quote itself, right? So I said, in the most famous and at times controversial line of the document, Jefferson insists, quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So a few things here. One, make sure you're actually putting quotation marks around this thing, right? Anything where you're using the exact language has to have quotation marks around it. Notice here that before I bring in the quote, I used a colon to set it up, right? You could use a comma here as well. Either one works. Again, it's just kind of separating your words right here from the quote itself, right? Notice that in the original, this is the way it looks in the original text, that Jefferson chooses to capitalize certain words, right? Creator, rights, life, liberty, happiness, right? So if he capitalized them, I have to capitalize them too. I have to use all the same punctuation. The assumption is whatever is in within those quotation marks, it should look exactly the way that it does in the text that I'm using, right? And again, I think, Creator, he's talking about God here. That's why he capitalizes it. He wants to show how important these things are, rights, life, liberty, happiness. I think he's just capitalizing there to emphasize their importance, right? Notice that I cited it. This text that we're using, it's really short. It's only 2 pages long, so it doesn't have page numbers. But I still want to show the audience where this is in the text. So this is in paragraph 2 of the Declaration of Independence. Since I mentioned Jefferson before the quote in the signal phrase, I don't need him in the citation. All I need is the location of the quote, PAR2. If you had page numbers, you just use the number in that citation. Maybe it's 4, whatever it is. And then notice that I put a period after the citation, not inside the quote, okay? But let's, obviously the best way to handle this line would be to directly quote it. Let's say, though, I wanted to put it in my own words, that I could simplify it, right? That would be a paraphrase. And as I mentioned earlier, the difference between a summary and a paraphrase is that a summary is not going to get into details. It's not going to be an idea necessarily specific to a certain author, right? A paraphrase is going to be a lot more specific. And the goal is to not use too much of the same language. Otherwise, you should just quote the thing and call it a day, right? But if I wanted to try to put it in my own words, I try to say this same thing. Just try not to use the same language, right? I'd still set it up with a signal phrase to show that this is Jefferson's idea, not mine, right? Jefferson insists that it should be obvious that there are rights that people should have from the moment they're born. They should not be prevented from having the freedom to do things that allow them to find fulfillment in their lives. Essentially, I'm saying the same thing as he said here. It doesn't sound as pretty, I don't think, but it's getting the job done, right? So notice that since I'm putting it in my own words, it doesn't need quotation marks around it. I didn't use, things like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If I did, I'd have to put quotation marks around that stuff, even within the paraphrase, right? Notice, this is important, it should still have a citation showing where the audience could find the actual quote if they wanted to, right? So this is in paragraph 2. Again, if I didn't mention Jefferson here, I'd have to put him in the citation, right? And then we have our end punctuation after the citation. So again, just wanted to show you the difference between these different skills. Hope that helps. Bye.